Welcome to the podcast Never Again Is Now. Today we are going to be discussing what happens when you're confronted by anti-Semitic remarks in public situations and how to respond to these. Usually my co-host Evelyn Marcus is with me. She's unable to be with me today. She is featured in the documentary Never Again Is Now, which you can see on Amazon and YouTube. She's a Dutch Jew, the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, she immigrated to the United States because of anti-Semitism. And I'm Phyllis Dimbler Miller. I'm the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, The Edge of the Wedge. I grew up in the Midwest, Elgin, Illinois, a small town not of Holocaust survivors, but our parents and grandparents had escaped the Tsar and other pogroms in Europe. And yet in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever. Today, I want to welcome Alex Maws. He's the head of education and heritage for the Association of Jewish Refugees in Great Britain, as well as the UK delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which of those of you who follow our program know we talk about that alliance a lot and the definition of anti-Semitism. But we're not doing that today. Today, we're going to talk about, I read an article that Alex Maws, an opinion piece that he wrote, and I was very recently in the Jewish News, which is a UK newspaper, right? And I want to talk to him about it. So he wrote describing an event to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day, featuring a Holocaust survivor as the keynote speaker. And yet, there was a very interesting anti-Semitic question that was asked publicly, and I want him to tell us about it and the reaction and go from there. Alex, the floor is yours, or the mic.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Phyllis. Thanks for having me on the podcast, and it's a pleasure to be here. It feels a little strange to be talking. You mentioned about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and I am a delegate to that. I have been for many years. And I talk all the time about anti-Semitism in that capacity. It feels weird to be on a podcast where I'm talking about a very personal experience I had. Normally, I'm sort of talking about it in the big picture. But there I was at a Holocaust Memorial Day event. I should rewind, I suppose, and say that, in the UK, Holocaust Memorial Day is a very successful event. Over the past 20 plus years, it's really developed into a sort of a well-received sort of civic commemorative event. It's not just for the Jewish community or anything like that. Schools and local governments and churches and all sorts of institutions often will hold some sort of commemorative ceremony. Now, I go to many of these professionally speaking because I work for the Association of Jewish Refugees. It's just what we do every January as we go from one event to the other. In this case, I actually wasn't at this event in a professional capacity. I went to my local event organized by the London Borough where I live, and I'm not going to name it because I'm trying to avoid shaming the organizers publicly or anything like that. I think they had all the best of intentions and that sort of thing. But I just thought, well, as someone who is involved in these issues, it's the right thing to do, to go to my own local event as well and show some support. And so there I was, sort of sitting quietly in the back of the room, and it was I think a pretty good Holocaust Memorial Day event. Insofar as you can judge good ones and not good ones or whatever, but they had a survivor on hand who sort of spoke for 30 minutes or so, told her personal story, and it was very moving, and she was pulled no punches at all, and she was actually a survivor I hadn't heard before, so I was taking great interest in it, and then it got to Q&A, as they often do, and I think I think it was maybe the second question or something from the audience was a woman actually who happened to be sitting next to me, and and she sort of rambled a bit. I don't know. I should think of a more polite way to say that. There's sort of a lot of prologue, sort of talking about her, how, some of it was legitimate, talking about how, inspirational it was to hear from this particular survivor, and it was quite meaningful to her. And she had a personal connection. She wanted to sort of make it known that she'd recently been to Israel, and she, that sort of thing. And And she said, and so now I want to get to, the thing I really wanted to know is, you know, Jews are so good at business. What's your secret? And uh, and I was, I sort of perked right up all of a sudden. I was like, oh God, this is not going anywhere good. And I looked around the room. Mind you, there's probably, I would estimate, 100 people at this event. It was in the town hall, in at the sort of formal chamber where the council meets, and it was, sort of had the air of, quite a prestigious event. And people from across the community were there. Again, wasn't a Jewish event. I live in a very diverse part of London. And I just sort of looked around and I thought, surely someone noticed what's just happened here. And to my dismay, no one said anything. No one even, I was even just trying to sort of make eye contact with anyone who might have picked up on it and sort of had one of those moments like, wait, did she just say what I think she said? Even the Holocaust survivor who she was posing the question to, who presumably has heard, she's a sort of a fairly regular speaker. I assume she's heard everything at this point, and nothing phases her. And maybe that was part of the problem, that she's heard everything and nothing phases her, but she just sort of let it just wash right over her. And she's, sort of answered the question in very vague terms, not about Jews, but about her own sort of personal perseverance and that sort of thing. So she sort of got around it by not actually answering it. But I was just shocked that here we are at an event, and I should say that the every year Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK has a theme, and this year's theme was ordinary people. So the theme was all about, the ability of individuals to, to make a difference and use their voice for positive change and that sort of thing. And like, we had just had that whole message, sort of like reinforced by one speaker after the next. And it's like, is no one of these ordinary people here in attendance going to seize this moment and say something? And they didn't.
I have to interject because on November 9th for Kristallnacht, I had a really small group at my synagogue, and we discussed answering these kinds of anti-Semitic questions. And what I learned is first you have to educate the audience. So we need to tell our audience why, while that woman might have had the best of intentions, why that is an anti-Semitic comment and what it can lead to and why it needed to be answered. So could you take that, let's go into that for a moment.
Sure. Well, I mean, the association of Jews with, business success is related to sort of Jews and money and Jews and banking and these sorts of things. And it goes back to medieval times when Jews were excluded from many professions, and they served an important function in Christian societies for being able to do the jobs in terms of religious sort of law that Christians weren't able or willing to do themselves. So Jews took on certain professions as users, moneylenders, things like that, because that was sort of what was available to them. So fast forward many centuries, and now that's become, to some people, it's seen as, as we're going to, I think, discuss, a sort of positive characteristic of Jews. They see that, this woman thought she was being complimentary, but other people, use that as a stick to beat Jews with. It's like, they're not just good with money, they're greedy, they're controlling, and that sort of thing. And so, the origin, you could take it either in the sort of positive or the negative direction. Doesn't matter. The origins of it, in any case, are negative because it involved the exclusion of Jews, and this taps into, centuries of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes and that sort of thing.
And it's very important to address today, in my opinion, because it's being used against Jews. So that's why we are discussing how we have to be careful that when we think they're compliments, they aren't. I mean, I would tell you what I would have hoped the Holocaust survivor would have said, and then we'll get to what you said.
Okay.
I would have liked her to say, yes, some Jews are good at making money, just as other non-Jews are good at making money, but there are many, many, many poor Jews, huge number, of which Jewish organizations spend a great deal of effort and money helping these poor Jews. So really, Judaism has no claim to fame of being successful at money. Anyway, that's what I would hope that I would have been.
That's great. And I'm very glad we're recording this as a podcast because I'm going to refer back to that. I'm going to use that.
Okay. So now tell us what happened and what you did, and then we'll go from there.
Well, what I resolved to do is, is to speak to her privately afterwards. And I did. It was sort of near the end of the event anyway, and so it wasn't long after that, and because she was sitting right next to me just as people sort of applauded at the end, and I think there was like a little reception, people were filing out. I just turned to her and said, sorry, quick moment, this is, you could tell I'm not originally from Britain, but I still live in Britain. I have to observe by all the British norms of polite conversation. Do you have a quick moment so I could have a word? And I basically said, I'm quite sure you didn't mean it this way, but the question that you asked about Jews, what's the secret to the Jews' success in business, is actually quite anti-Semitic. And of course, I'm sure you would never have intended that, but I just wanted to let you know, in the hope that next time this comes up, you'll try to avoid saying something like that. And I have to say, she was genuinely baffled by what I was talking about. She had never heard of such a thing before. She couldn't imagine how that could be taken any way that was at all negative. And I gave my my best attempt at sort of saying something along the lines of what we said a minute ago about medieval, ancient tropes. But of course, in the moment, no one's ever good at this sort of thing. Doesn't matter if you're I'm on the IRA committee on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, and I was terrible in the moment. It doesn't matter what your professional qualifications are in the moment, in the heat of it. And she said, well, if someone said that about me, I wouldn't have a problem. I said, well, but different communities don't have that same stereotype applied to them. And, I sort of didn't want to get into the well, how would you feel if someone said X about your, I feel like it's never useful to do a sort of comparative, sort of stereotype Olympics or something like that. But what she said to me, she said, well, I think it's true though, and I think there's probably evidence that supports it. I said, okay, I would love to see what that is. She said, well, I believe in evidence. I believe in facts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go home and I'm going to Google it. I'm going to do some research, and if I find out that it's not true, then I'm definitely going to stop saying that. I was like, at that point, I just felt like, okay, I just cut my losses here. I'm not going to convince her. She's so sure that she believes that evidence exists, and when she Googles it, she's going to find the evidence that supports her. So that's how it was left.
Okay, now I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Why didn't you speak up publicly?
Well, I mean, part of it is I think it was a time issue. I don't even remember if they were taking more questions or not, but I do feel like it's a legitimate question. And part of me just thought, all right, well, I don't want to sort of, I was about to say ruin the Holocaust Memorial Day event by turning it into something more confrontational. Although, quite frankly, that would have been a great Holocaust. Imagine all the talk that people would have had leaving that Holocaust Memorial Day event about this actual discussion about contemporary anti-Semitism that broke out at the HMD event. But I think that actually, like many people, there is a certain element of sort of internalized, I don't know, shame or something, where we feel like we need to be apologetic, don't want to make a fuss. And again, doesn't matter what your professional background is. We are, we're wired the way we're wired sometimes. And particularly in Britain, there has been a lot of talk in the past several years. It's been a sort of very hot button topic about anti-Semitism, and a lot of people saying, these public figures are anti-Semitic, and lots of supporters of those public figures saying, oh, you're just using that as a political stick to beat someone with. And I think I've internalized some of that to the extent it's oh, I don't want to be that guy that's accusing someone of anti-Semitism, then the whole room's going to be turning on me. And I know I was right. And yet I still, in the moment, that didn't that wasn't enough. So I don't know if that was part of it as well.
I'm not sure that I would have spoken up publicly. Um, a few years ago, my adult daughter and I were at a presentation through the Writers Guild Foundation here in Los Angeles about the Latino writing community. And it's the first time that I had ever heard anti-Semitism expressed, not just by one of the two, one of the panel, but by two. Both my daughter and I were shocked. This is at the time before I had my podcast and had been practicing what to say. I don't know. Had I been better prepared, could I have stood up in the audience and said, I'm uncomfortable? Would I have been calm enough to say, I'm really uncomfortable? Perhaps you don't realize what you're saying. I mean, in the one case, the woman was saying that she had a very close Jewish friend and that her Latino friends, Latina, wanted to know why she had a Jewish friend. And her response was not what I would have liked, which is why not, was to say, well, he's been a friend for a long time,
Right.
well, which is not the answer. And then someone else went on and on about writing for Jews on a show. And since I knew who they were and I knew they were Israeli and where probably they were coming from, I understood that he didn't understand where they were coming from.
Right.
But I don't know. I still don't know. This is years ago and it still haunts me. What could I have said to explain that that was really anti-Semitism? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things in our show is we try and prepare people for those moments, which is what we're doing today. So,
I'm very glad you're doing it. I wish I knew about your podcast 6 weeks ago.
so what I would like to tell us a little bit about your background since you're not a Brit.
Well, I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I moved to the UK. Well, I started working in the field of sort of Holocaust education. Before I moved to the UK, I worked around sort of 2000 to 2003 or so for Facing History and Ourselves in Boston, Massachusetts, and I moved to the UK in 2003 to do a master's degree. I thought I was going to come here for a year, and it's like almost 20 years later. It is 20 years later now. But I started working at some point. I taught for a few years, and then I went back into the field of Holocaust education. I worked for a charity here, a nonprofit called the Holocaust Educational Trust for 10 years. And for the past 6 years or so, I've been working for another organization called the Association of Jewish Refugees, heading, as you said in the introduction, our educational work.
So was there a personal family reason that got you interested in this subject, or did you just kind of fall into your job of Facing History and Ourselves and just go from there?
It's a good question. It's a funny question because I'm Jewish, and like most Jews, you don't have to go very far in my family tree to find people who were victims of the Holocaust. I have a great uncle who's a survivor, and my grandfather emigrated to the United States before, long before the war, but most of their siblings were all murdered. My great grandparents were murdered, so I have a very direct connection to it. I didn't know most of that at the time I went to work for Facing History 20 odd years ago. It was a job that came up. Someone recommended it to me. I thought, oh, that sounds sort of interesting. And it was actually through that I became much more interested in the topic, and really decided that this was, the career that I wanted to pursue. So the personal connection, the realization of my personal connection actually came after I was already doing the work, which is sort of a weird way around, I think.
Yes, yes, it is interesting. I don't quite understand how you could not have known that about your great grandparents, but
Well, I knew it, but it's one of these things, like I didn't think about it. It was, it was sort of not part. I don't know. It just, I don't know. It's weird. I know.
no judgment. Although yesterday I was on a Zoom reunion for my mother's family, and two of the people who called in were survivors of the whole direct descendants, because while this town in Latvia, Vishki, the Jews were wiped out, they were teenagers. I mean, they're direct ancestors who were in Riga at the moment. So it's very much on my mind today after hearing these people with their Latvian accents, how close. And we never knew it. I thought I had no relatives connected until one of my second cousins did all this research, and what it meant continues to mean to these people that my cousin found them and that there were relatives who had survived in the United States. I mean, it's amazing how much it means to them.
Yeah.
So that's why I was just kind of surprised that you didn't know that your great grandparents.
Blame my parents.
I know. So let's go back to, have you thought about, it was anything that might have worked better with this woman? I mean, I don't know that. I mean, in retrospect, is there something that together we can come up with?
Well, so there's a detail that I haven't mentioned yet that I will, which
Okay.
is the final thing I said, sort of as we were kind of wrapping up that very frustrating interaction. Honestly, I was just trying to sort of end it on a polite note, and I said, "Oh, so what brought you here anyway?" And she said, "Oh, I just love Jews so much." So she had told me in the course of the conversation that she's a very devout Christian, apparently. And as I mentioned, she'd recently been to Israel, and I can't make any assumptions about her. I know that there are some, not all, but some, strands of Christianity who feel very strongly about, Israel. And she had that kind of philo-Semitism where it was like she had like this reverence for Jews, but it was like on a biblical level,
Yeah.
and so the idea that she loved the Jews so much was sort of like, well, what does that actually mean to you? Because it's like, if you love Jews so much, first of all, you love Jews and you think that they are successful business. It's like, I wonder, what is the thing that you believe that you love? And secondly, is it just the sort of Jews of biblical times? Do you have much regard for Jews today, such as the one standing in front of you telling you that he was offended by something that you said? So there was a lot wrapped up in this
Yeah.
interaction. And so the question of, could I have said or done anything differently? I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at this as like a therapy session where maybe you could tell me.
You know what? I'm just wondering, would it have been interesting to why she thought that?
That she loves the Jews, you mean?
No, no. Why, where do you, what is your belief that why do you believe that Jews are successful in business as opposed to another group? In other
What
words,
she
I know. Okay. What I'm trying to say is, one of the things that I know is changing one person's mind at a time. It's all we can do. I just really wonder where she got the idea. Is she aware of
right.
where she got the idea?
Well. Look, I mean, you're an expert in this subject
No,
yourself. You've got a podcast and all sorts of things about it. But I mean, I think that, and she's an example of I think what one of our main challenges is as it relates to fighting anti-Semitism, which is that there are the sorts of anti-Semites who give Heil Hitler salutes and
right.
paint swastikas on things and call people like racial insults. And that's pretty easy to identify. And those people are probably proudly anti-Semitic. They
Right.
would be pleased to be identified as one. And then there's the much more challenging area of people who do not at all identify as anti-Semites. They probably think of themselves as sort of proud anti-racists generally. They would be horrified. They would never sort of knowingly say something insulting to someone's face. But those people exist in a world where anti-Semitism is in the ether. It's everywhere. And we all absorb these tropes and myths and stereotypes, like it's just information about how the world is ordered. And so she was as sure of that fact as she was of the sky being blue or something like that. And so that's the challenge, where I feel like, and this gets at the the question of what do you say? I feel like it is important, I think you would agree with this, and probably most listeners would as well, that we need to push back against these sort of very casual, sort of everyday examples of anti-Semitism. It's sometimes called like dinner party anti-Semitism. It's just very polite and acceptable, sometimes so polite that it's not even noticed, because if the whole problem is that people pick up on that just in the ether, then by continuing to do it, we're just adding more of it out there and making it more acceptable, making it more mainstream. So even though it's uncomfortable to turn to someone who you're having an otherwise friendly interaction with, maybe it's even a friend or a colleague or something like that, and push back, that's exactly the thing, because it's like, I'm not going to change the mind of some rabid anti-Semite on Twitter or something like that. They are, that's a lost cause.
Yes, I would
But
agree.
this person is possibly a cause that, so that could be salvaged. I don't know.
And many times people are glad to know it. I was just reminding someone I was speaking to earlier, who has become a very good friend, that when I corrected him in the project we were working on, he had said about someone, a Jewish donor to something, and he said, I didn't know he was that rich. And I said to my friend, I'm not saying his name, friend, that I know you didn't mean it that way, but it could be misinterpreted because of the tropes of Jews and money. It's much better to say, I didn't know he was that philanthropic. And
Very good.
And so I told my friend that I was speaking to you later today and remind me of that. But you see, if you just say it really nicely, and he was glad to know that. So that's the thing that we have to think about. So sometimes that people would want to be, I don't want to say corrected, but explained to, if that's because they don't want to go around. He would not have been happy if he found out that he was saying something that could be interpreted as anti-Semitic. And
Yeah.
you know that the Claims Conference had a campaign recently. It started with words, which I love because
Yep.
it started with words. So how do we convince the listeners of this podcast today that we are not talking about something trivial, that we are talking about something really important that all of us can do in our daily life?
Yeah. So I have two thoughts on that. I mean, one, I agree with you. I think the It Started With Words campaign was excellent, and it's such a pithy phrase, and it encapsulates a lot. But, and what I would say to whether it's this woman at the event or anyone listening or anyone out there, yes, these words about Jews being good at business, is that really all that harmful? Well, it's not much of a leap then, if you believe that, to say, well, all Jews are rich. And then it's not much of a leap to say, well, they're also rich because they're greedy. And the greed is also part of them being sort of controlling. And the controlling is part of them being all powerful. And these are the sorts of words, just words, that inspire, serious, violent anti-Semites who commit terrorist acts against Jews. So yes, I mean, and this isn't to say, this is going to cause the next Holocaust or something like that, but it does cause actual violence against actual people. These words do matter. And having said that, and this kind of connects to the question about what could we do in these sorts of situations generally in the future? I'm a believer in the adage of call them in, don't call them out. And this kind of, goes back to the thing about why didn't I stand up and say something at the event? Now, I could have said something supportive publicly, but like people who are known to you, who are friendly, it's not a confrontational situation, you're probably going to make a lot more progress by calling them in, saying, let me explain to you, rather than how dare you use that kind of anti-Semitic language, and if you start making accusations about people, they go immediately on the defensive. They can't possibly have been wrong because, they know what their intent was. Now, of course, we know that it's not necessarily about the intent, it's about how it's received. And that's the kind of thing that when you call someone in, you can tell them, you can use your I statements.
I was going to say, yes.
It's like, let me tell you how it feels to me.
Yes.
When I hear you say this, what I experience is, and that's calling them in rather than calling them out.
Yes, let's repeat that. The I statements. I felt badly when you said that about the rich Jew, because it could be, and instead of saying, you just said it, blah, 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 using I statements about, so you said that earlier when you said something about she didn't realize about offending you, although I would be careful about the word offensive. I would be more, and I'm just thinking, I would say, because then they get really, again, feel badly. I mean, I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah.
It takes practice. We have,
Yeah.
we have to practice.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're right about the word. I mean, it's interesting that a word like offensive now has taken on a meaning that it implies, like it to say that something is offensive can be perceived as a hurtful thing to say to the person who said the thing that was offensive,
Right,
which is a little bit insane, but that's where we are,
right, exactly. This has been a really exciting conversation. I really hope that our listeners of the podcast take it to heart and think about an everyday conversation where we can help influence a more positive attitude towards Jews. So I'm going to give you last words. What would you like to share that
Oh
we
gosh. I I don't know. What would I like to share? I would like to share that I am there's a great new book out right now by Dave Rich, who does a lot of work around anti-Semitism here in the UK. That is called, oh no, this is
yes,
terrible. I'm on a live podcast. I forgot the name of it. I've just started reading it, and I feel like this goes back to your question about like, how did I not know about my own family's history in the Holocaust? But I also feel like I've spent a lot of my own life as a Jew, and even part of my professional life being involved in this work, not knowing myself about some of these issues, not being very well versed in them, and having done, as I said before, internalize some of the kind of shame, internalize some of those tropes myself. And I feel like we can all just like learn more about it, and that goes back to the thing about just being better equipped in these situations. And so yeah, maybe that's something I would recommend.
okay. Do you want to look up the name of the book while I say?
Yeah, yes. Okay, thank you for letting me letting me do that. You go ahead.
Uh, so I was going to thank Alex for his participation. Thank you, listeners. I do want to say that those of you who have not seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can read more about my play, Thin Edge of the Wedge, at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And Alex, what's the name of the book?
Yes, it is called Everyday Hate, how anti-Semitism is built into our society and what you can do about it.
That sounds like exactly on point.
Exactly. I feel like this book was written for you and your listeners.
Okay. And the author's name again?
Dave Rich, he works for the Community Security Trust here in the UK, and he is sort of this country's leading voice in challenging anti-Semitism. You should get him on the podcast.
I was going to say to you when we turn off, will you connect me? Okay. Again, thank you to our listeners. And here's how we end every single podcast. Without putting yourself in physical harm, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.